I know I usually talk about historical depictions of witches and feminist theory, but today I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about the Phantom of the Opera.
Sing, my angel of music. Sing for me.
I mean, feminist theory probably affects how I interpret this play, but we aren't going to be talking about any witches. So, I apologize if you came here for that. When I say I want to discuss Phantom of the Opera, what I really mean is I want to discuss one scene in particular, and why it fails so miserably in Joel Schumacher's 2004 film adaptation. And that scene is the point of no return.
Past the point of no return, no going back now. Our lives should play us now at last begun.
Point of no return is a really important moment in both the play and movie adaptation. And in some ways, the movie adaptation adds a lot more for us, the audience, to unpack with that scene. However, the scene overall is a mess. Before we get into understanding the scene and why the 2004 adaptation fails so miserably at adapting it, we first must understand what is Phantom of the Opera. And to fully understand that, we must take a step back into the 19th century and look back at the French novel that inspired all of this. The 19th century was a very interesting time. Between great strides in both science and engineering, we also see great social inequality and civil stability. The time is marked by mass deaths, from the American Civil War to another French Revolution, rampant cholera and tuberculosis breakouts, and general disease and untimely death. Also, not to forget death from arsenic and other heavy metal poisoning that was caused by poor fashion decisions. There also came an interest in the past. Not that there hadn't always been an interest in the past in our ancestors, but there had never been an interest in historical accuracy. During Shakespeare's time, the actors wore contemporary costuming. There really was no interest in historical costumes or clothing. Even in Macbeth, a play that takes place in 11th century Scotland, the actors traditionally wore more contemporary costuming. Renaissance painters painted, well, Christ, mostly in contemporary clothing or contemporary ideas of what he would have worn. And so did medieval artists. Sorry, but Mary would have not worn that. Even in the 17th and 18th centuries, there really wasn't that big of an interest in historical accuracy. And this isn't because there was no interest in the past, but because the main purpose of art and stories was to take these stories and make them more contemporary and relevant to the contemporary audiences. It's generally accepted that the Gothic revival movement was inspired by historian and author Victor Hugo, as well as the return of Catholic popularity after the French Revolution. Victor Hugo's novel, Notre Dame de Paris, also known as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, is set in Gothic France and centers around Notre Dame Cathedral, which, during Victor Hugo's time, had fallen into great disrepair due to hundreds of years of use and then years of abuse under the French Revolution. While modern audiences are more interested in the social justice aspects of the novel, the novel was really about one thing, and that is why Notre Dame's important and why it should be preserved. It's really just a love letter to Notre Dame. And it worked. The Gothic revival period shortly after this began. All around France, Gothic churches and structures began to go under great restoration. Soon, the Gothic revival and Victorian styles were also born, styles which were directly inspired by the Gothic architecture. This interest in medievalism was also seen in literature. Arthurian legends became incredibly popular again, and unless you're a medieval scholar, you're probably more familiar with the Victorian writings of Alfred Tennyson and his versions of King Arthur. In painting, with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, we have artists depicting medieval and early Renaissance stories in a late Gothic and early Renaissance style. The name of the group refers to painting in a style before Raphael, pre-Raphael, if you will. Out of all of this came the Gothic horror genre, a subgenre of Gothic literature. The Gothic horror genre can be traced back to as early as the 18th century, but it truly doesn't pick up pace and doesn't really flourish until the 19th century and then later into the Victorian era. Gothic horror as a genre is a mix of horror, fiction, and romance, really. Some of the greatest examples of this style would be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and pretty much anything written by Edgar Allan Poe. Some of these authors and their stories would not be fully appreciated until later in history. For example, at the time of its release, Frankenstein was met with mixed reviews. However, the genre marched on. These stories are all dark, and all focus around some kind of supernatural entity or force. As well as they'll vaguely reference the past, and they all kind of say something about human nature, or are reacting to some kind of contemporary fear of the masses. Frankenstein, for example, was written in reaction to the concerns of science and religion beginning to butt heads. Dracula grapples with the concepts of redemption and damnation in the face of sexuality. And Edgar Allan Poe, well, he was just disturbed. By the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, the Victorian era aesthetics were beginning to fade out. By the 1920s and 30s, the Victorian style and anything associated with it were seen as dark, disgustingly opulent and flamboyant, and overall just outdated. As early as 1914, when World War I began, the style was already being seen as being just a little too lavish, just a little too over the top. And after World War I, well, it was seen as even more disgusting and distasteful. And that's where Phantom of the Opera comes in.
Look at your face in the mirror. I am there inside.
The novel is written by Gaston Leroux, a French Gothic author who had worked also as an opera critic. Prior to writing Phantom of the Opera, he had already written 6 novels, 2 of which, The Mystery in the Yellow Room and The Perfume Lady in Black, had been already extremely successful and popular.
Popular. I know about popular. And with an assist from me to be who you'll be, instead of dreary who you were, well, are.
The Phantom of the Opera novel was interesting, to say the least. Merriam-Webster's Encyclopedia of Literature notes about the Gothic genre that Such novels were expected to be dark, tempestuous, and full of ghosts, madness, outrage, superstition, and revenge. And despite Eric being just a man, he actually checks off most of these boxes. He's ghost-like, he's vengeful, he has all this superstition surrounding him, and he's extremely violent. Yet, despite the novel's great sales, it was not met with good reviews. The New York Times in 1911 wrote that the novel essentially lost all of its suspense after you realize Eric was not a ghost and just a deformed man. And while I'm not saying the novel is great and is not without error, I will say I don't believe this is a fair criticism. I think part of the reason the novel was met with so many poor reviews had to do with that the Gothic style of literature was on its way out by this point. But the thing that made Leroux's writing so interesting was how he used mystery in his novels. He wasn't the only Gothic author to incorporate mystery, but the way he did it was a little bit different. He used it to frame his stories. The Phantom of the Opera novel is told by a narrator who's looking back at the events of the book retroactively and trying to solve the unsolved mystery of the opera ghost. Furthermore, the novel is inspired by real events and rumors that were around at the time, and that all focused around the Opera House Garnier. The Opera House was rumored to have a faceless man who lived under the Opera House in the water tank that people called a lake. The events that really inspired the novel came from the mysterious incident when the Opera House's chandelier counterweight broke, causing the chandelier and counterweight to go crashing down. And this left Leroux with a question. What if it wasn't an accident? What if it had been done on purpose? What if the ghost of the Opera House, the faceless man that lives underneath it in the water tank, what if he was a vengeful man or spirit? And what if he was the cause of the accident? So already, despite this having kind of a gothic aura around it, it's obvious Leroux was more interested in the mystery aspect of it. And it's not that mystery novels weren't popular during this time. It's just that you didn't really read your gothic horrors for mystery. You read them for your Frankensteins and your Draculas and, while all those stories incorporate a level of mystery, they don't want a mystery novel. This also coupled with the growing disinterest in the Gothic genre as a whole, as well as readers at this point just expecting every Gothic novel to just be another run-of-the-mill story, really. Eric being just a man and not actually a ghost was not well received. However, I have a suspicion Eric being a man was not the issue, but that the real issue is what that means for the novel. The novel actually has a fairly profound meaning behind it. While not absolving Eric of his crimes, the novel notes that Eric could have been a profound musician and an amazing human had society not abused and ostracized him for being deformed. The novel is not saying Eric is not responsible for his actions, but rather that we as a society must also own up to our own crimes, our own sins, if you will. We have created a society that breeds monsters, and we have to own up to that. While most Gothic novels at the time do have some kind of moral about mankind, there's always this kind of, it's not our fault, or the fault falls upon one person. It's never this kind of society is the problem. And while Charles Dickens, at the same time, is kind of writing novels that explore that theme, they weren't gothic horror. So I think they were just a little better received because of that. All of the gothic horror stories had a good versus evil kind of theme to it. And the issue really is, at the core of it, is that Eric is not completely evil. Eric is not the monster. Eric, at the end of the day, is super sympathetic. Dracula is not sympathetic. And while the creature from Frankenstein is sympathetic, Dr. Frankenstein himself is the true monster, therefore is the one that is less sympathetic. At the end of the day, the issue here is that Eric is not the monster. The monster is not Christine. The monster is not Rao, or the Persian, who is the character in that book. The monster is society. And those who read Gothic horror were not interested in those kind of morals. They wanted good versus evil. They wanted stories that at the end of the day still told you that mankind was inherently good. That mankind and its goodness could trump the evils, could overcome the monsters of the night.
And listen to the music of the night.
And that's not what the Rose novel is telling us. And you would think, after all of this, that the Phantom of the Opera would just fade into obscurity, be forgotten about. But the exact opposite happened. In as early as 1925, we have our first film adaptation of the novel. After the 1925 film, there are countless of novels, plays, movies, graphic novels, comics. Almost every medium there is out there, there is some adaptation of this story. Others better than others, some of them twisting it to fit their own agenda. And I can't really talk about all of them in depth, nor do I want to. But there's one out of all of them that has stood the test of time, that to this day continues to be probably the most beloved adaptation of this novel. And that is Andrew Lloyd Webber's 1986 musical, The Phantom of the Opera. This is the version you're probably most familiar with. Most people who have been to Broadway have either seen Phantom of the Opera or a Disney adaptation. And as of 2006, Phantom of the Opera became Broadway's longest running show in all of history, and to this day continues to play. I actually have a theory that when the world ends and we're all in shambles and society has fallen over, this play will somehow continue to show on Broadway. And the success to his adaptation wasn't just the great music or being fairly faithful to the source material, but it was that Andrew Lloyd Webber had an idea, one that actually really helped it out, and it was, what if the Phantom wasn't completely deformed? What if half of his face was deformed and the other half was, well, hot? What if we play up the sex appeal and kind of push down the whole he's a creep factor and save that for later? What if when we first introduce the Phantom, you're like, ooh, that's kind of sexy, and it works. And not only does it work, it adds a lot more to his and Christine's relationship, as well as a lot more to his character. In 2004, there came the movie adaptation of the musical. And there's a lot of issues with it. More important issues being Joel Schumacher is a terrible director, and Gerard Butler can't sing. But despite this, I actually really like this movie. I think it's kind of fun, and kind of a... I fully recognize and completely agree that the stage production is leagues better. But there's some things that the movie does that actually I think are quite compelling and work a little bit better than the stage play. And now it's time we speak of the scene. It's time that I cross the point of no return.
Past the point of no return. No backward glances or games of make-believe are at an end.
For those who've not seen Phantom of the Opera or need a reminder, let's quickly talk about the lead up to this scene. The Phantom crashes the masquerade ball and presents to the opera managers the play he has written, Don Juan Triumphant, and demands that they perform it. Don Juan Triumphant is a fictional opera inspired by Mozart's Don Giovanni. This is done to draw parallels between Eric and Mozart, who are both musical geniuses. And much like Don Giovanni, Don Juan Triumphant is supposed to be ahead of its time. It's not like all those old, boring operas that people have been performing for hundreds of years. This is new, it's interesting, it's revolutionary. But the most interesting part is there's actually a lot of parallels between Don Giovanni and Phantom of the Opera. That being of a self-absorbed man who believes he can do whatever he wants and never pay the price for it. However, Don Giovanni ends with Giovanni being dragged to hell by demons to pay for his sins. He never gets the girl, and he's forced to face his consequences. However, from what we can infer, Eric's opera probably ends with Don Juan getting the girl and escaping any kind of consequence for his actions. It's almost like Don Juan Triumphant is a fan fiction that was written in reaction to Eric identifying with the character of Giovanni, but not liking how the story ends. I think something really important to remember that a lot of people forget is that The Point of No Return is a song written by Eric to be performed between Don Juan and the object of his affection. None of this is how Christine feels. This is not Christine telling Eric how she feels. This is Eric writing down a character and writing down how he wants Christine to act. It's important to note also is that Don Juan is supposed to be played by Piangi. Piangi is, however, killed by Eric, and Eric takes his place, wearing this costume cloak that covers his face and his whole body in this very flowy yet kind of weird shape. It's barely a costume, if I'm being honest. And when he comes out on stage at first imitating Piangi, unless you've seen the play before or know the story, you're a little like, who is that? Is that Piangi? Like, I'm not gonna lie, the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, I guess black is a slimming color. Or at least I tell myself that. When he comes out on stage, though, Eric is imitating Piangi. He has an Italian accent that is slowly being dropped. Also around the time where he's dropping more hints to Christine that he is not Piangi. He's breaking choreography. the accent fades. He starts getting more and more aggressive. Christine begins to realize something is going on and it's not what she thought. The Point of No Return is not just a song in an opera. It's a moment in which the action in the opera that's being performed mimics the actions that are happening in the play. Don Juan is put on a disguise in order to seduce a woman. Eric has taken Piangi's spot and is acting as him without Christine knowing. He is deceiving her yet again, and this is all in hopes of seducing her. Something that he's done consistently time and time again, using deceitful moves to try to impress her. Of course, when Christine realizes who she is, she removes his hood, revealing that it's Eric. And this is when something also interesting happens. That's when Eric goes off script and imitates Rao and rips off his promise from All I Ask of You.
Say you want me with you here, beside you. Anywhere you go, let me go too. Christine, that's all I ask.
This is because Eric, despite being 50 in the narrative, has the emotional maturity of a toddler. He does not know how to show true affection. He can only do it through imitation and manipulation. He first imitates the Angel of Music, a figure that Christine's dead father used to tell her about and promised would guide her when he was gone. Then he imitates Mozart. Then he imitates Rao. I'm not here to argue that the Phantom doesn't love her, but rather that he doesn't have the emotional development to show her that he loves her. He can only do it through imitation because he does not know how to truly act. He's a toddler emotionally. He throws temper tantrums. He believes Christine owes him something. He also has no real consideration of how his actions will affect anyone else. He has no real concept that his actions have consequences. Everyone to him is an object. The Point of No Return is Eric trying to convince Christine that she can no longer deny her love and affection for Eric, and that she must make a decision. Either accept him or reject him. Of course, though, he's definitely leaning towards the side of, it's too late to reject me. What ends up happening is Eric is actually sealing his own fate. He's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. While he thinks he can escape the same fate as Giovanni in Don Giovanni, he's actually just sealing the same thing. And yes, I understand that in The Phantom of the Opera, the mobs that comes after him at the end of the play don't actually catch him, which leads the whole "it's never been really solved" kind of part of the story. But Eric does in some ways have hell come for him, just differently. He realizes that he was wrong. He realizes that he was the monster and that it didn't matter what his face looked like, that the true monsterhood was inside of him. It's the inversion, in some ways, on the Beauty and the Beast story. It's his soul where the true distortion lies. And the most interesting thing is, all of this development comes from the Point of No Return. The Point of No Return is not Christine's point of no return. but rather Eric's. Now, where does the movie go wrong? At least up till now, in the movie, things had pretty much been the same to the lead up. Eric is using imitation and manipulation to try to seduce Christine. He's still emotionally a toddler that wants to play with your Barbie doll. And despite all the pretty much the same foundation being built up to it, the scene just doesn't work. The first issue I want to address is the Phantom's costume. In the play, he's wearing this weird kind of flowy and shapeless cloak. The movie, however, well, when he comes out, he's wearing a black masquerade mask, and that's like it, really. It's very obvious it's not Piangi. It's very obvious that it's Eric, the Phantom that they have all been hunting down up to this point. Because of this, there's no mystery for Christine to discover. There is no tension. There is no suspense being built up. The next issue is because Christine knows it's Eric. Like I said, there's no suspense. There is no moment where she goes, oh no. There is no real moment of horror. Rather, the movie right away just tries to play up the whole, ooh, she's being mesmerized by him. And like, at this point I'm kind of like over that. Because at this point he's done it multiple times. I'm like, okay, really, this again? By this point in the story too, she's more afraid of him than attracted to him. So having this scene, her being attracted and it being sexy, doesn't really make sense. And I'm not here to shame her for being attracted to him, because she's very obviously attracted to him, and I don't blame her. When we first meet the Phantom too, I'm kind of like, okay, I could, especially when he sings Music of the Night. It's really not until you begin to analyze those lyrics that you're kind of like, I don't know, dude, but if someone's saying that to me in this like kind of mystical dungeon area, I might also swoon a little. But like I said, at this point in the story, Christine is so afraid of the Phantom that it's a little hard to believe that she would be so quickly to go back on that. Literally, the scene before this, Rao is trying to convince her to perform in this play that she doesn't want to perform in because she's so horrified that the Phantom is gonna abduct her again. Because she knows it's Eric. When Eric in the movie sings the line from All I Ask of You to Christine, it doesn't make sense. In the context of the play, he's been caught, he's been found. At this point, he's realized, okay, Angel of Music no longer wins over her, can't use that to mesmerize her. Apparently this whole play I wrote for her didn't work. Well, apparently she likes this Raoul guy, so what if I steal from him? Maybe that'll work. It's a last attempt. It's a desperate attempt to mesmerize her once again. It's not him being sincere. It's not him trying to be romantic. It's him mimicking someone else because he doesn't know how to truly be romantic himself. And that's the real issue here, is it doesn't make sense in the movie, because she's already mesmerized in the movie. She's like leaning up into him and she's feeling that. And then he starts to sing that line from All I Ask of You, and it almost like breaks her out of the trance. It's almost like she's like, wait a minute, I love Raoul. Why on earth am I like grinding up to you? Now, the biggest issue is how all of this affects Christine unmasking the Phantom. While the unmasking is a physical, literal thing that happens, it's also a metaphorical moment, if you will. It's not just her revealing his deformed face to the opera goers and being like, it's him, the opera ghost. It's not who we thought it was. It's also Christine telling Eric no matter who he imitates, no matter who he copies, his love will never be sincere. That she's seeing past it all, that she's seeing the love he's showing her is a facade. It's her letting Eric know none of this works because it's not genuine. And that's a really important thing to realize. And you don't get that feeling in the movie. In the movie, she gives him kind of like this like sorry look, like as if like she didn't mean to unmask him. Kind of like just kind of happened. You started singing and I lost all control and was just trying to rip your clothes off. Oh, also those tango dancers in this scene make no sense. The point of no return is not this sexy push and pull sequence where Christine must either give in to the Phantom or reject him. It's all about the Phantom being deceitful and not realizing that he himself is about to cross the point of no return. It's him essentially dooming himself to the same fate as Don Giovanni. And don't get me wrong, it is a sexy song, but it's not supposed to be a sexy scene. This scene's issues are essentially all the same issues that are wrong with the movie as a whole. It just feels like Joel Schumacher is not comfortable enough with musicals as a genre, nor is he comfortable enough with like the source material to make it compelling. It's almost like he doesn't know how to make two people singing interesting unless it's like this weird sexy pointless music video. And that's not what the point of no return is. It's not sexy filler. It's not just sexy for the sake of being sexy. There is a deeper meaning here. And like I said, I'm not trying to say the song isn't sexy. It's a very sexy song that's juxtaposed against a really horrifying scene when you think about it. It's about a predator deceiving his prey. And the song, while it might be kind of sexy, when you juxtapose those images, you should feel uncomfortable. You should feel uncomfortable that the Phantom is making Christine perform this to him without her knowledge. As far as she's concerned, that's Piangi. As far as she's concerned, she is not being groped up by the Phantom, who is actually getting sexual pleasure out of it. As far as she's concerned, she's just being touched by an actor. It's a scene. And that's really horrifying. And that juxtaposed the song is what makes this scene so powerful and so memorable. That it's a horrifying scene that will further cement the fates of these characters. In the play, Christine is being flirtatious because she's acting. She does not know that she's being flirtatious with the man who abducted her in Act 1. The movie has Christine knowingly being sexual and flirtatious with a predator. And I don't like that. Not only does it miss the whole mark of the scene, it's also just kind of gross. And that's why this scene in the 2004 movie adaptation fails. It fails to understand the true horror behind it. But I mean, what are we supposed to expect from the man that put nipples on Batman? Joel Schumacher's Phantom of the Opera is a great example of how not to adapt a stage musical into a musical film. I think one of the best scenes to analyze for that is the point of no return. It really shows what happens when you do not understand the medium of musicals or understand the scene itself. What can go wrong? And let me tell you, everything went wrong here. The real issue I wanted to address here is why it's important to properly understand the source material that you are adapting. Joel Schumacher did not just make a boring adaptation, he made a dangerous one. Christine at this point does not want the Phantom. At this point in the story, she is horrified of him. Yes, maybe she's still sexually attracted to him, and maybe, there's still a part of her that's like, maybe if you weren't a psychopath, like, you could tap this. But overall, any feelings that she has for him are overshadowed by her fears that he's gonna hurt her. And Joel Schumacher just doesn't grasp that concept. And I think that's dangerous for those who watch these movies and for those who also love this story. It undermines the narrative, it undermines the implications of this scene, and all we are left with is a sexy number between a predator and his prey.